welcome to our channel. Welcome, gentle listener, to a quiet journey through stone and shadow. Tonight we drift back to a time when sleep was earned through endurance, and warmth was a fragile, precious thing. In the silent depths of medieval winter, behind walls built for war, people lay awake listening to wind howl through arrow slits. Let yourself settle into this slower world, where the rhythm of days was measured by the distance between one cold night and the next. Imagine yourself there, wrapped in coarse wool, breath clouding in darkness, waiting for dawn. The surrounding castle is a fortress against enemies, but no defense against winter's patient siege. Before we step into those frozen halls together, I have a small request. If you'd be so kind, tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History. Your presence here in these late hours means we can continue these nocturnal wanderings through forgotten corners of the past. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what hour finds you now. Some of you may be in the stillness of deep night, others greeting morning or somewhere between. Dim your lights. If you haven't already, perhaps let a gentle fan hum in the background. Now let us begin our passage into the long winter nights of the 14th century. The tower chamber stands in the northeast corner of the castle, catching the worst of the wind. Lady Avellaneda sits by the tall window watching frost-etched patterns across the glass, delicate ferns and flowers that bloom only in winter's grip. The glass itself is a luxury, a sign of her husband's wealth and status. But tonight, as the wind howls against it, she thinks it might as well be cloth, for all the warmth it provides. Behind her, the chamber, fire burns high and bright, fed by oak logs that servants carried up 5 flights of stairs. The tapestries on the walls ripple slightly in drafts that somehow find their way past stone and fabric. These tapestries tell stories, knights slaying dragons, ladies in gardens of eternal summer. She's looked at them so many times, she knows every stitch, every faded thread. The largest tapestry depicts a hunt in a verdant forest, with hunters in bright garments pursuing a white hart. She can trace the path of the hounds through woven undergrowth, can count the birds perched in stylized trees. Another shows a wedding feast with tables laden with impossible amounts of food and wine. The figures perpetually raise their cups in celebration, their joy frozen in wool and silk. Her husband has been gone for 3 months now, riding south to attend the king's council. His absence transforms the castle, from a home into a fortress of silence. Avellaneda pulls her fur-lined cloak tighter around her shoulders. Even with the fire, even with her layers of wool and velvet, the cold finds ways to reach her. The fur is from a wolf hunted last winter in the forests beyond the castle walls. She remembers, when the hunters brought it back, how its pelt seemed to retain some quality of the living animal, fierce and wild. Now it serves as armor against the cold, though even its thick warmth seems insufficient. The chill creeps through every gap, every loosened fold of fabric. The brazier near her bed glows with charcoal, tended by her maid who sits in the corner dozing. Its heat is a small circle of comfort in the vast coldness of the chamber. The charcoal was made in Kill in the forest, burned slowly over days to achieve the right consistency. It provides a different kind of heat than wood, steadier, more enduring, but somehow less alive. She should sleep. The hour is late, past midnight perhaps, but sleep has become difficult, elusive, something that flees when she pursues it. Her physician calls it melancholy, a disturbance of the humors brought on by winter darkness. He prescribes warmed wine with cinnamon, long prayers, and patience. The physician is an elderly man who learned his craft in monasteries far to the south. He speaks of the body as though it were a vessel to be balanced with fluids and essences that must be kept in harmony. His remedies sometimes help. The warmed wine does make her drowsy, and the spices provide momentary comfort, but they cannot touch the deeper cold that has settled into her spirit. But Avellaneda suspects the cause is simpler than that. The cold keeps her awake, not the cold of the body but of the spirit. These stone walls were built by her husband's grandfather during a time of raids and warfare. Every stone was placed with defense in mind, not comfort. The old man had been a soldier before becoming a lord, and his priorities showed in every aspect of the castle's design: thick walls, narrow windows, positions chosen for visibility rather than pleasantness. Avellaneda has heard stories of his campaigns, of battles fought in distant lands. The castle stands as his monument, a testament to a life lived in readiness for violence. The arrow slits that line the corridors admit thin streams of freezing air. The thick walls that protect against siege engines also trap the cold inside like wine in a barrel. In summer, the thickness of the walls provides relief from heat, keeping the interior cool and pleasant. But in winter, that same mass of stone becomes a reservoir of cold that no fire can fully dispel. She rises from her seat by the window and walks to the fire. The heat hits her face almost like a blow, and she holds her hands toward it. Her fingers are pale, almost translucent in the fire light. She wears rings, gold bands set with stones, but they feel heavy tonight like shackles. One ring bears a ruby that catches the fire light and throws it back in crimson sparks. Another holds a sapphire, dark as midnight, that her husband gave her on their wedding day. The rings mark her status, her position in the world, but they also bind her to this place, to these responsibilities she cannot abandon. She thinks of her childhood home in the south, smaller but somehow warmer. Perhaps it's memory that makes it so. The way the past always seems gentler than the present. Her father's manor had been built of timber and stone, less imposing but more intimate. She remembers rooms where sunlight pulled in golden patches, where summer seemed to linger even into autumn. The gardens there had been her refuge, filled with herbs and flowers that her mother tended. She can still recall the scent of lavender and rosemary, the hum of bees in summer heat. The maid stirs in her corner, opens her eyes briefly, then closes them again. Avellaneda envies her this easy sleep, this ability to rest. Despite everything, the girl is young, perhaps 16, fresh from a village beyond the forest. She came to the castle last spring, recommended by the Banff. As honest and hard-working, she has adapted to castle life with ease that Avellaneda sometimes resents. The girl sleeps soundly, eats with good appetite, seems untouched by the melancholy that pervades these winter months. Avellaneda returns to the window and looks out at the winter landscape. The moon is full, turning the snow-covered hills into waves of silver. It's beautiful in its way, the kind of beauty that requires distance that would kill you if you stood too close. She imagines walking out into that moonlit snow, feeling it crunch beneath her feet. The frost on the window pane creates a veil between her and the landscape, distorting the view into something dreamlike. She traces a finger along the glass, feeling the cold bite through her skin. Beyond the castle walls, the forest rises dark against the snow. The trees stand skeletal, stripped of leaves, their branches reaching toward the sky like supplicant hands. But that's a dangerous thought, the kind that comes to lonely women in deep winter. She turns away from the window. The chamber contains everything she could need: chests of fine clothing, books of hours with illuminated pages, a standing mirror of polished silver. Yet none of it provides what she craves most: warmth and the sense of being less alone. The chests hold gowns in rich fabrics, velvet, silk, fine wool dyed in costly colors. They represent wealth that most people will never know, luxury beyond imagination. But what good are fine clothes when there's no one to see them, no occasions to wear them? The gowns remain folded in darkness, their beauty wasted. The books of hours are works of art created by monks who spent years illuminating each page. She sometimes opens them to admire the intricate paintings, saints with golden halos, gardens of paradise rendered in jewel-like colors. She sits at her writing desk and lights another candle. The parchment before her is the beginning of a letter to her husband, started 3 days ago and still unfinished. "My dearest lord," it begins, and then her hand had faltered. What can she tell him? That she's cold, that she lies awake listening to wind, that winter has stretched on so long she can barely remember summer. These seem like complaints unworthy of her station. She is the lady of this castle, responsible for its management. In her husband's absence, she picks up the quill, dips it in ink and continues writing. The cold has settled deep into these stones and I fear it will never leave them. She pauses reading the words back. They sound dramatic, almost foolish, but she lets them stand. I imagine warmth as a living thing. She writes, a spirit that visits those it favors and abandons the rest. It has abandoned this place. I think the ink flows dark across the pale parchment, forming words that feel both necessary and inadequate. How can she explain what these winters do to her soul? The maid snores softly in her corner. The fire crackles outside. An owl calls, a lonely sound that echoes off the tower walls. The owl has nested somewhere in the castle's upper reaches, in one of the abandoned chambers, or perhaps in the dove cote. Its hunting cry pierces the night, wild and somehow mournful. Avellaneda continues her letter describing her days, the household accounts. She reviews the servants, she supervises the chapel services she attends, but between each mundane detail the cold creeps back into her words. She writes of the stewards, reports of grain stores, measured and counted. She mentions the brewing of ale, the salting of meat, the ordinary business of keeping a household running through winter. Furthermore, she describes the chapel services that mark each day, matters at dawn, vespers, at dusk, the measured rhythm of prayer, the chaplain's Latin, washes over her like distant music, familiar but incomprehensible. I often wake in the night, she confesses to the parchment, convinced. I hear footsteps in the corridor, but when I send the maid to investigate there's never anyone there. These waking moments are the worst, the space between sleep and alertness where fear grows unreasonably large. She hears sounds that might be nothing, the creak of a door, the whisper of fabric, the soft fall of ash in the grate. Her mind conjures explanations, intruders, spirits, warnings from God. But morning always reveals mundane causes, a door unlatched by wind, a cat prowling the halls, the natural settling of ancient timbers. The castle has its own language of sounds, creaks and groans that speak of age and weather. She has learned to interpret some of them, but others remain mysteries that disturb her sleep. She knows these fears are childish, unworthy of a woman of her rank and years. Yet knowing doesn't make them vanish. She remembers winters of her youth when she slept soundly and woke to frost on windows with delight. When did winter change from wonder to endurance? As a child she had delighted in the first snowfall, running out to catch flakes on her tongue. Her father had taken her sledding on the hills behind their manor, her laughter bright in the cold air. Perhaps it was the first time she attended a winter burial, a servant's child who caught fever and couldn't fight it off. The frozen ground resisted the gravedigger's tools, and they had to wait 3 days for Thor. She remembers standing in the chapel yard watching the men struggle with picks and shovels. The mother had wept silently, her face gray as the winter sky, or perhaps it was the winter. Her own infant daughter took sick and no amount of fire or prayer could keep the cold from her small body. That was 5 years ago, but the memory is fresh as yesterday's snow. The baby had burned with fever despite the cold season, her small body caught between fire and ice. Avellaneda had held her through the worst of it, feeling life slip away despite every effort to hold it close. They buried her in the chapel yard. When the ground finally yielded, Avellaneda had planted rosemary at the grave, though she knew it would struggle in this northern climate. Since then, Avellaneda has feared winter with a deep, instinctive dread. It's not the physical cold she fears, it's what the cold enables, what it allows to enter the world. Winter seems to thin the boundaries between life and death. Between safety and danger, it creates conditions where the vulnerable cannot survive, where warmth and care prove insufficient. She finishes her letter with conventional pleasantries, hopes for her husband's health, prayers for his safe return. She signs it, sands it, seals it with wax. The wax is red, bearing the impression of her husband's seal that she keeps in trust during his absence. The mark is a falcon with spread wings, his family's ancient symbol. Tomorrow she'll give it to a messenger riding south. Whether her husband will understand what she's truly saying, she doesn't know. He's not an unkind man, but he lives in a different world. His concerns are politics and land management, the complex web of obligations that bind the nobility. She stands and walks to her bed, a massive piece of furniture with carved posts and heavy curtains. The maid has turned down the covers, revealing linen sheets and piled furs. The bedposts are carved with acanthus, leaves and heraldic beasts, the work of craftsmen brought from the continent. It represents wealth and status, but tonight it seems merely a cold expanse to cross. She climbs in, still wearing her shift and cloak. The sheets are cold, despite the bed warmer that was passed between them earlier. The bed warmer is a pan filled with hot coals dragged between the sheets to take the worst chill off, but its heat fades quickly, leaving only the memory of warmth. The maid closes the bed curtains, creating a small fabric cave. The darkness is complete, suffocating almost. Avellaneda lies still, listening to her own breathing, to her heartbeat in her ears. The cold seems to press down on her like a weight. The curtains are heavy, brocade, intended to trap warmth and create a private space, but in the darkness they create, she feels buried rather than sheltered. She thinks about prayer, about the rituals that are supposed to bring comfort. She whispers the words her chaplain taught her, but they feel empty. Tonight the prayers are in Latin, learned by rote, though she understands only fragments, Ave Maria, Gratian, plainer words that should bring solace, but tonight seem as distant as stars. The fire beyond the curtains shifts and settles. The maid moves about the chamber, preparing for her own sleep on a pallet near the hearth. Avellaneda closes her eyes and tries to imagine warmth, true warmth, the kind that comes from sun on skin. But the image won't come. Instead, she imagines the castle in summer, with birds singing in the courtyards and flowers blooming in the herb garden. She walks through it in her mind, feeling phantom sunlight. In her imagination, the chapel yard is green, the rosemary at her daughter's grave grown thick and fragrant. Bees work among the flowers, and the air is soft with summer heat. She pictures the great hall with its doors thrown open, fresh rushes on the floor scented with meadow. Servants move about their tasks without the burden of winter clothing, their movements lighter. It's a trick. She's learned this mental escape from winter's grip. Sometimes it works well enough to let sleep come. But tonight her mind keeps returning to the present. She hears the wind finding its voice in the chimney, singing its bornless song. She shifts position, pulling the furs higher. Her body is warm enough under these layers, but her mind remains chilled. The furs are heavy, bear and wolf and fox, layered to create insulation. Their weight is both comforting and oppressive, like being pinned beneath the world's darkness. She thinks about her husband in London, whether he's cold too, or whether the city's crowded buildings and constant fires keep the worst of winter at bay. She imagines him at the king's court, warm and well-fed, surrounded by light and laughter. Perhaps he doesn't think of her at all, doesn't wonder if she's warm or comfortable. Men have different concerns, different worlds. Or perhaps he too lies awake some nights thinking of this northern fortress and the wife he left to manage it. Perhaps distance makes him kinder in imagination than he ever is in presence. She remembers their last conversation before he departed, practical discussions of estate, business and household matters. There had been little tenderness, but then there rarely is. After years of marriage arranged for alliance rather than affection, these thoughts circle through her mind like water circling a drain. She knows from experience that once this pattern starts, sleep will be hours away. She considers calling for the maid, asking for more warmed wine, but that would mean admitting defeat, acknowledging that sleep has won another night. Instead, she lies still and tries to calm her breathing. She counts her breaths, 1, 2, 3, trying to find a rhythm that will carry her toward rest. Somewhere in the castle a door slams. She hears raised voices, guards on the walls perhaps, or servants arguing in the kitchens below. The sounds are distant, muffled by stone and distance, but they remind her that she's not alone. The castle is full of life, even in these dark hours. The guards walk their rounds on the battlements, changing positions every 4 hours. The kitchen servants sleep near their ovens, taking what warmth they can from the dying fires. That thought provides small comfort. She's surrounded by dozens of souls, servants, guards, chaplain. Yet she's never felt more isolated in her position. Loneliness is expected, almost required. A lady does not befriend her servants or share her troubles with those below her station. She has no family nearby. Her parents are dead, her siblings scattered to their own marriages and estates. Her husband is her only peer, and he's absent more often than present. Furthermore, her mother died of a fever 6 years ago, her father following within the year of what the physicians called a broken heart. Avellaneda had been unable to attend either burial. Her own pregnancy keeping her confined. This is the cost of her position, she reminds herself. The privilege of wealth and comfort comes with its own burdens, but tonight those burdens feel heavier than usual. The cold seems to amplify everything: loneliness, fear, the slow passage of empty hours. She opens her eyes in the darkness of the bed curtains. No light penetrates here. She might as well be in a cave buried deep in winter earth. She reaches out and parts the curtain slightly, letting in a thin strip of fire light. It falls across her face like a blessing. The maid is asleep, now curled on her pallet. The fire has burned down to embers still glowing but producing little heat. The girl sleeps with the abandon of youth, one arm flung out, her breathing deep and regular. Avellaneda watches her for a moment, envying such easy rest. Avellaneda knows she should close the curtains again, trap what warmth she can, but she leaves them parted, preferring the dim light to complete darkness. She watches the embers pulse and fade. Pulse and fade. There's something hypnotic about it, something that quiets the racing of her thoughts. The embers hold the ghost of flame cores, of heat wrapped in ash. They remind her that even dying fires retain some essence of warmth, some memory of burning. Time passes. She's not sure how much. The chamber grows gradually colder as the fire dies. She can track time's passage by the quality of cold, the way it deepens and spreads as the fire's protection weakens. Each moment brings winter closer to her bed. Finally, somewhere between cold and exhaustion, sleep finds her. It's not the deep rest she craves, but a shallow drifting full of fragmentary dreams. She dreams of walking through the castle in summer, with sunlight streaming through every window. She dreams of warmth as a golden liquid that fills the halls like water. Furthermore, she dreams of her daughter, alive and laughing, running through summer grass. Furthermore, she dreams of her husband returning, bringing spring with him. In the dream, her daughter is older than she ever lived to be, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. Her hair is bright in sunlight and her laughter echoes off stone walls transformed by warmth. But even in dreams the cold finds her. The summer castle turns slowly to winter. The golden warmth drains away, her daughter's laughter fades to silence. She wakes with a start, heart pounding. The chamber is dark except for the dying embers. For a moment she doesn't know where she is. Then memory returns and with it the familiar weight of winter. She's in her tower chamber, she's alone. It's still night. She lies back down, pulling the surrounding furs. Her body aches from tension, from holding herself rigid against the cold. Her muscles protest the hours of stillness, the unconscious bracing against winter's assault. She stretches slightly, feeling joints crack and complain. She closes her eyes again, but sleep doesn't return. Furthermore, she lies awake listening to the wind, waiting for dawn. The wind has picked up strength, howling around the tower with renewed vigor. It sounds almost like voices, though she knows it's merely air moving across stone. This is her winter. Not the grand winter of tales and songs, but the small, grinding winter of cold nights and empty hours. Not tragedy but tedium. The providers sing of dramatic winters, of lovers parted by snow, of noble suffering transformed into art. Her reality is more mundane, but no less difficult. When spring finally comes, and it will come eventually, she'll walk the battlements to feel the Thor beneath her feet. The relief will be so profound it will feel almost spiritual. But that morning is months away. For now there's only this endless night, this cold that seeps into everything. She thinks about writing to her husband again, trying to explain what these winters do to her. But what would she say? That it's not the cold that keeps her awake, but the thought that warmth may never return. That each winter feels longer than the last, harder to endure. That she fears one winter she simply won't survive, not physically, but in some deeper way. That the cold will finally reach her core and turn her to stone, like the surrounding walls. These are the thoughts that come in the darkest hours, when even faith feels distant. She knows they'll seem melodramatic in daylight, but that doesn't make them less real. Now, in the morning, she'll rise and resume her duties with proper dignity. She'll speak to the steward, visit the kitchens, attend chapel services as though nothing troubles her. The maid stirs and rises, coming to tend the fire. She adds wood, blows gently on the embers, coaxing them back to flame. The girl works efficiently, building the fire with practiced hands. She has learned the castle's rhythms, when to rise, how to tend fires and prepare chambers. The new fire catches and grows, pushing back the darkness slightly. Avellaneda watches from behind her curtains, grateful for the light. "My lady," the maid calls softly, "shall I bring you something, wine or bread?" "No," Avellaneda answers, her voice rough from disuse. "Just tend the fire, that's enough." The maid nods and continues her work. The flames grow brighter and Avellaneda feels their warmth beginning to reach her bed. It's not enough to make her comfortable, but it's something, a small mercy in a long night. The heat moves in waves, pushing back the cold inch by inch. It's a battle that will be fought again tomorrow night and every night until spring. She closes her eyes again and tries once more to sleep. This time, mercifully, it comes. The sleep is thin, easily broken, but it's better than lying awake. She drifts in and out, aware of the chamber sounds, of the maid moving quietly about her tasks. When she wakes again, gray light is filtering through the window. Dawn has come, bringing another day to endure, another march toward spring's distant promise. The tower chamber stands in the northeast corner of the castle, catching the worst of the wind that sweeps down from the mountains beyond. Lady Avellaneda sits by the tall window watching frost-etched patterns across the glass, delicate ferns and flowers that bloom only in winter's grip, their crystalline structures more intricate than any embroidery she has ever seen. The glass itself is a luxury, a sign of her husband's wealth and status, imported at great expense from craftsmen in the lands who guard their secrets jealously. But tonight, as the wind howls against it with a sound like distant wolves, she thinks it might as well be cloth, for all the warmth it provides. The panes rattle slightly in their lead casings, and she can feel the cold radiating from them even at arm's length. Behind her, the chamber. Fire burns high and bright, fed by oak logs that servants carried up 5 flights of stairs on their shoulders, their breath coming hard in the thin air. The flames leap and dance, casting shadows that move across the walls like living things, and the heat it throws is fierce enough to burn her cheeks when she stands too close. The tapestries on the walls ripple slightly in drafts that somehow find their way past stone and fabric, following paths known only to the wind itself. These tapestries tell stories, knights slaying dragons with lances of gold thread, ladies in gardens of eternal summer where roses never fade and fountains flow endlessly. She's looked at them so many times. She knows every stitch, every faded thread where the dyes have surrendered to time and sunlight. In the flickering firelight, the figures seem almost to move, the knights raising their weapons, the ladies turning their embroidered faces toward her. Her husband has been gone for 3 months now, riding south to attend the king's council where matters of war and taxation are debated in halls she has never seen. His absence transforms the castle from a home into a fortress of silence, each room echoing with emptiness, each corridor stretching longer than it did when his voice filled them. She imagines him in London, surrounded by other lords, their voices raised in argument or laughter. While she sits here in this northern isolation, Avellaneda pulls her fur-lined cloak tighter around her shoulders, the soft pelts brushing against her chin. Even with the fire, even with her layers of wool and velvet, the undershirt of fine linen and the outer gown of deep blue Damascus, the cold finds ways to reach her. It seeps through every gap, every opening in her armor of fabric, persistent as water, seeking cracks in stone. The brazier near her bed glows with charcoal, tended by her maid, who sits in the corner, her head nodding as sleep threatens to claim her. Its heat is a small circle of comfort in the vast coldness of the chamber, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of winter. The metal sides of the brazier tick and ping as they expand and contract, a sound she has learned to find almost comforting in its regularity. She should sleep. The hour is late past midnight. Perhaps, though, time is difficult to judge in these endless winter nights. But sleep has become difficult, elusive, something that flees when she pursues it and refuses to come when she lies still and patient. Her body is exhausted, but her mind continues its restless turning, circling the same thoughts, like a dog seeking a place to rest. Her physician calls it melancholy, a disturbance of the humors brought on by winter darkness and the absence of her lord. He prescribes warmed wine with cinnamon and cloves, long prayers in the chapel where incense clouds the cold air, and patience, above all patience for spring's return and her husband's homecoming. He speaks with confidence, this learned man with his charts of stars and his vials of tinctures, but she sees uncertainty in his eyes. But Avellaneda suspects the cause is simpler than that, more fundamental than any imbalance of blood or bile. The cold keeps her awake, not the cold of the body, which can be fought with fires and furs, but the cold of the spirit that settles in the chest and refuses to be dislodged. It is a cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with absence. These stone walls were built by her husband's grandfather during a time of raids and warfare, when Scottish forces swept down from the north like winter storms. Every stone was placed with defense in mind, not comfort, each one fitted to create barriers that could withstand siege engines and battering rams. The old man had been a warrior first and a lord second, and his priorities are written in the very bones of this place. The arrow slits that line the corridors admit thin streams of freezing air that cut like blades across any passage. The thick walls that protect against siege engines also trap the cold inside like wine in a barrel, holding it in their massive stone embrace, where summer's warmth can never quite penetrate. She has heard that castles in the south are different, warmer, lighter, built more for living than for dying. She rises from her seat by the window and walks to the fire, her skirts whispering across the floor, rushes that have been strewn with dried herbs to mask other smells. The heat hits her face almost like a blow, and she holds her hands toward it, watching the flames reflect in the rings she wears. Her palms tingle as warmth returns to them, the sensation almost painful after the numbness of cold. Her fingers are pale, almost translucent in the fire light, the blue veins visible beneath skin that has seen no sun for months. She wears rings, gold bands set with sapphires and garnets, gifts from her wedding and from births, but they feel heavy tonight, like shackles rather than ornaments. She twists one absently, feeling the metal warm against her skin, wondering if her husband still wears the ring she gave him or if he has removed it to keep it safe. Furthermore, she thinks of her childhood home in the south, smaller but somehow warmer, its walls of timber rather than stone. Perhaps it's memory that makes it so, the way the past always seems gentler than the present, softer in its edges and kinder in its judgments. She remembers running through halls that didn't echo with each footfall, sleeping in a chamber where her mother's room was close enough to hear if she called out. In the night, the maid stirs in her corner, opens her eyes briefly to check the fire, then closes them again with the ease of someone whose conscience permits rest. Avellaneda envies her this easy sleep, this ability to rest despite everything, the cold, the darkness, the isolation of this place. Perhaps it is different when you have no responsibilities beyond the next day's tasks, when your mind need not stretch beyond what is immediately before you. She returns to the window and looks out at the winter landscape, pressing her fingertips to the cold glass. The moon is full, turning the snow-covered hills into waves of silver, each drift and hollow rendered in shades of white and shadow. The forest beyond the castle grounds is a dark mass against the snow, the bare trees like scratches on parchment. It's beautiful in its way, the kind of beauty that requires distance, that would kill you if you stood too close without protection. She imagines walking out into that moonlit snow, feeling it crunch beneath her feet, the cold air burning in her lungs. She imagines walking until exhaustion takes her, until she simply lies down in that silver world and lets winter claim her. But that's a dangerous thought, the kind that comes to lonely women in deep winter, when the darkness seems to stretch forever. She turns away from the window, deliberately, placing the view behind her. Such thoughts are sins, whispers from the devil who seeks to steal souls through despair, and she crosses herself quickly, a ward against her own mind's treachery. The chamber contains everything she could need: chests of fine clothing lined with cedar to keep the moths away, books of hours with illuminated pages showing saints in golden halos, a standing mirror of polished silver that shows her reflection dimly. Yet none of it provides what she craves most: warmth and the sense of being less alone in the universe. All the wealth in the world cannot purchase this thing. She sits at her writing desk, its surface scarred with years of use, and lights another candle from the one already burning. The parchment before her is the beginning of a letter to her husband, started 3 days ago and still unfinished, the ink of the first lines already fading to brown. She looks at the familiar opening, wondering how to continue. "My dearest Lord," it begins. And then her hand had faltered, the quill hovering above the page like a bird, uncertain of landing. What can she tell him? That she's cold, when he has provided the finest fires and furs? That she lies awake listening to wind, when he has given her the securest chamber in his castle? That winter has stretched on so long? She can barely remember summer, can barely recall what warmth feels like in her bones. These seem like complaints unworthy of her station, the whining of a child rather than the observations of a lady. She is the lady of this castle, responsible for its management in her husband's absence, the household accounts, the servants' wages, the stores of food and fuel. She oversees the spinning rooms where women turn wool into thread, the kitchens where cooks prepare meals for dozens of mouths, the chapel where the chaplain says masses for the household souls. Furthermore, she picks up the quill, dips it in ink and continues writing, each word formed carefully in the script her tutors taught her years ago. The cold has settled deep into these stones and I fear it will never leave them. The words appear black and stark against the pale parchment, more permanent than she intended. She pauses reading the words back, hearing how they sound in the silence of the chamber. They sound dramatic, almost foolish, the kind of thing a young girl might write in her first season away from home. But she lets them stand because they are true, and truth seems more important than dignity. Tonight I imagine warmth as a living thing. She writes, the quill scratching against the rough surface, a spirit that visits those it favors and abandons the rest. It has abandoned this place. I think she knows this is fanciful, bordering on heretical, attributing will and choice to something as basic as temperature. But in the deep hours of night it feels true. Warmth is not merely absent here, it has fled, driven away by something in the very nature of this fortress. The maid snores softly in her corner, a gentle sound that speaks of unconsciousness and peace. The fire crackles, a log shifting and sending up a shower of sparks that dance behind the iron screen. Outside, an owl calls, a lonely sound that echoes off the tower walls. Another creature awake while the world sleeps. Avellaneda continues her letter, describing her days in the measured language appropriate for correspondence between lord and lady. The household accounts she reviews each morning, checking the steward's figures for errors or theft. The servants she supervises, settling their disputes and ensuring the castle runs smoothly. The chapel services she attends twice daily, kneeling on cold stone while the chaplain's voice rises toward vaulted ceilings. But between each mundane detail, the cold creeps back into her words, asserting itself despite her efforts at normal. She describes the frost that forms on the inside of windows each morning. The way water freezes in the washing basins, despite being brought up warm. She mentions how the wine must be heated before it can be drunk, how bread turns hard as stone when left out overnight. I often wake in the night. She confesses to the parchment, her hand moving almost independently of her will convinced. I hear footsteps in the corridor, outside my door, but when I send the maid to investigate there's never anyone there. She hesitates, wondering if she should include this admission if it makes her seem weak or fearful. These waking moments are the worst, the space between sleep and alertness where fear grows unreasonably large, where every shadow holds a threat. She hears sounds that might be nothing, the creak of a door expanding or contracting in temperature changes, the whisper of fabric where tapestries move in drafts, the soft fall of ash in the grate. Her heart pounds as she lies rigid in her bed, straining to identify each noise. Her mind conjures explanations for these sounds, each one more alarming than the last intruders who have somehow penetrated the castle's defenses and wander the halls seeking valuables. Or worse, spirits of those who died here, the grandfather who built these walls or the soldiers who fell defending them. Warnings from God about some failing in her stewardship or her soul. But morning always reveals mundane causes, when they can be found at all. A door unlatched by wind because some servant forgot to bolt it properly. A cat prowling the halls in search of mice. The natural settling of ancient timbers as they adjust to temperature and weight. She knows these fears are childish, unworthy of a woman of her rank and years, unbecoming to someone who should trust in God's protection. Yet knowing doesn't make them vanish, doesn't stop her heart from racing when she wakes in darkness. Knowledge and feeling are different things she has learned, and the latter does not always bow to the former. She remembers winters of her youth when she slept soundly and woke to frost on windows, with delight rather than dread. When did winter change from wonder to endurance? At what point did the season transform from something magical into something to be survived? Perhaps it was the first time she attended a winter burial, a servant's child who caught fever and couldn't fight it off despite the physician's best efforts. The frozen ground resisted the gravedigger's tools, and they had to wait 3 days for Thor before the small body could be laid to rest. She remembers standing in the chapel looking at the tiny coffin, understanding for the first time that winter could kill. Or perhaps it was the winter her own infant daughter took sick and no amount of fire or prayer could keep the cold from her small body, couldn't stop the fever that consumed her. That was 5 years ago, but the memory is fresh as yesterday's snow, sharp as ice. The child had been born in autumn, healthy and pink, but didn't live to see spring. Since then, Avellaneda has feared winter with a deep, instinctive dread that no amount of reason can dispel. It's not the physical cold she fears. She has learned to endure that with enough layers and fires. It's what the cold enables, what it allows to enter the world, sickness, death, all the dark things that thrive when warmth retreats. She finishes her letter with conventional pleasantries, hopes for her husband's health and continued favor with the king, prayers for his safe return. When spring makes the roads passable again, she signs it with her name and title, sands it carefully to dry the ink, seals it with wax heated in the candle flame and impressed with her signage ring. Tomorrow she'll give it to a messenger riding south, assuming the weather permits travel and the roads haven't become impossible. Whether her husband will understand what she's truly saying beneath the formal language she doesn't know. Perhaps he will read only the surface words and write back about practical matters, repairs needed, supplies to order decisions. Awaiting his return, she stands and walks to her bed, a massive piece of furniture with carved posts depicting vines and leaves and heavy curtains of green velvet. That can be drawn for privacy and warmth. The maid has turned down the covers, revealing linen sheets and piled furs, rabbit fox and one precious bear skin. The bed is a small fortress in itself, a place where she might find some protection from the night. She climbs in still wearing her shift and cloak, unwilling to expose herself to even the brief cold of undressing. The sheets are cold, despite the bed warmer that was passed between them earlier, a metal pan filled with hot coals and wrapped in cloth. She can feel where it was placed, a single warm spot in an expanse of cold linen. The maid closes the bed curtains, creating a small fabric cave, shutting out the dim light from the dying fire. The darkness is complete, suffocating, almost pressing against her closed eyelids. She can see nothing, not even the shape of her own hand. Before her face, Avellaneda lies still, listening to her own breathing, to her heartbeat in her ears, to the small sounds of her body moving against fabric. The cold seems to press down on her like a weight, like earth piled on a grave. She pulls the furs higher, burrowing into their animal warmth. She thinks about prayer, about the rituals that are supposed to bring comfort, the words that should connect her to divine presence. Furthermore, she whispers the words her chaplain taught her, the prayers for protection through the night hours, but they feel empty tonight, like sounds without meaning, syllables that vanish into darkness without effect. The fire beyond the curtains shifts and settles, and she can hear the change in its voice, the way the flames speak differently as logs collapse into coals. The maid moves about the chamber preparing for her own sleep on a pallet near the hearth, her footsteps soft on the rush-covered floor. She hears the woman sigh as she lies down, the rustle of her blanket. Avellaneda closes her eyes and tries to imagine warmth, true warmth, the kind that comes from sun on skin that penetrates to the bone. But the image won't come, won't solidify in her mind. Winter has lasted so long that she can no longer quite remember what summer feels like. Instead, she imagines the castle in summer, with birds singing in the courtyards and flowers blooming in the herb garden where the cook grows rosemary and thyme. She walks through it in her mind, feeling phantom sunlight on her face, hearing the buzz of bees among the lavender. She imagines warmth as a tangible thing, a golden light that fills every corner. It's a trick. She's learned this mental escape from winter's grip, this construction of summer in her mind. Sometimes it works well enough to let sleep come, lulling her with images of green and gold. Sometimes her imagination is strong enough to overcome reality. But tonight her mind keeps returning to the present, unable to maintain the illusion. She hears the wind finding its voice in the chimney, singing its bornless song, and the summer castle dissolves. She tries to rebuild it, but the wind is too loud, too insistent. She shifts position, pulling the furs higher, turning onto her side and then her back again. Her body is warm enough under these layers, protected by wealth and foresight, but her mind remains chilled, frosted, with thoughts she cannot escape. She thinks about her husband in London, whether he's cold too, or whether the city's crowded buildings and constant fires keep the worst of winter at bay. She imagines him at the king's court, warm and well-fed, surrounded by light and laughter, other lords and their ladies, musicians playing while courtiers dance. Perhaps there are fires in every room. Perhaps the press of bodies creates its own warmth. Perhaps he doesn't think of her at all, doesn't wonder if she's warm or comfortable in his northern fortress. Men have different concerns, different worlds, their minds occupied with politics and power. A wife left behind may not cross his thoughts from one week to the next. Or perhaps he too lies awake some nights thinking of this northern fortress and the wife he left to manage it. Perhaps distance makes him kinder in imagination than he ever is in presence, absence softening memory's edges. Perhaps he composes letters to her in his mind, words more tender than any. He speaks aloud. These thoughts circle through her mind like water circling a drain, each one leading to the next in endless succession. She knows from experience that once this pattern starts, sleep will be hours away. Her mind has caught on something and will worry at it like a dog with a bone. She considers calling for the maid, asking for more warmed wine or perhaps something stronger. But that would mean admitting defeat, acknowledging that sleep has won another night. It would mean revealing her weakness to a servant, which is its own kind of failure. Instead, she lies still and tries to calm her breathing, tries to quiet the racing of her thoughts. She counts her breaths, 1, 2, 3, trying to find a rhythm that will carry her toward rest. She focuses on the physical sensation of breathing, the rise and fall of her chest, the cool air entering her nostrils. Somewhere in the castle a door slams, the sound carrying through stone corridors. She hears raised voices, guards on the walls, perhaps, or servants arguing in the kitchens far below. The words are indistinct, but the tone of anger or alarm is clear. The sounds are distant, muffled by stone and distance, but they remind her that she's not alone in this place. The castle is full of life, even in these dark hours. Guards keeping watch, servants tending fires, perhaps others lying awake as she does. Dozens of souls shelter within these walls. That thought provides small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. She's surrounded by dozens of souls, servants, guards, chaplain. Yet she's never felt more isolated. Proximity and connection are different things, and the castle's inhabitants might as well be ghosts, for all the companionship they offer. In her position, loneliness is expected, almost required by the very nature of nobility. A lady does not befriend her servants or share her troubles with those below her station. Such intimacy would be inappropriate, would undermine the order that holds society together. She has no family nearby. Her parents are dead, taken by different ailments within a year of each other. Her siblings are scattered to their own marriages and estates separated by distances that make regular visiting impossible. Furthermore, her husband is her only peer, and he's absent more often than present. This is the cost of her position. She reminds herself the price paid for comfort and security. The privilege of wealth and comfort comes with its own burdens, its own forms of suffering that have nothing to do with material want. But tonight those burdens feel heavier than usual, seem to press down on her with almost physical weight. The cold seems to amplify everything, loneliness, fear, the slow passage of empty hours. Winter makes everything sharper, harder to bear. She opens her eyes in the darkness of the bed curtains, seeing nothing but blackness. No light penetrates here. She might as well be in a cave buried deep in winter earth, already in her tomb. She reaches out and parts the curtain slightly, letting in a thin strip of firelight that falls across the bed like a sword blade. It falls across her face like a blessing, warming her cheek. The relief is immediate and profound. The maid is asleep now, curled on her pallet, her breathing deep and regular. The fire has burned down to embers still glowing but producing little heat, the logs reduced to shapes of red and black. The room is dimmer than before, the shadows deeper. Avellaneda knows she should close the curtains again, trap what warmth she can in the small space of the bed, but she leaves them parted, preferring the dim light to complete darkness. Willing to trade warmth for the comfort of being able to see, she watches the embers pulse and fade their rhythm like a slow heartbeat. There's something hypnotic about it, something that quiets the racing of her thoughts. She finds herself breathing in time with their pulsing, her mind finally beginning to settle. Time passes, she's not sure how much time. Having lost its usual markers in the darkness, the chamber grows gradually colder as the fire dies, the warmth bleeding away into stone. She pulls the furs higher but doesn't close her eyes yet. Finally, somewhere between cold and exhaustion, sleep finds her like a thief. It's not the deep rest she craves, not the oblivion she needs, but it's a shallow drifting full of fragmentary dreams that make little sense. She dreams of walking through the castle in summer, with sunlight streaming through every window like water. She dreams of warmth as a golden liquid that fills the halls like water, rising and rising. Furthermore, she wades through it, feeling it warm her legs, her waist, her chest. Furthermore, she dreams of her daughter, alive and laughing, running through summer grass with flowers in her small hands. Furthermore, she dreams of her husband returning, bringing spring with him, the seasons changing at his command. Furthermore, she dreams of doors opening, of birds singing. But even in dreams the cold finds her persistent as memory. The summer castle turns slowly to winter before her eyes, the sunlight fading, the golden warmth drains away like water from a cracked vessel, leaving her standing in cold halls. Her daughter's laughter fades to silence, and when she turns to look, the child is gone. She wakes with a start, heart pounding, pulled from dreams into darkness. The chamber is dark, except for the dying embers barely visible. Now, for a moment, she doesn't know where she is, doesn't recognize her surroundings. Then memory returns, and with it the familiar weight of winter pressing down. She's in her tower chamber, she's alone. It's still night, still the endless winter night. She lies back down, pulling the surrounding furs, wrapping herself in their animal warmth. Her body aches from tension, from holding herself rigid against the cold, from fighting sleep. Her jaw hurts from clenching her shoulders, from hunching. She closes her eyes again, but sleep doesn't return easily. This time she lies awake, listening to the wind, waiting for dawn that seems impossibly far away. The hours stretch before her like an empty road. This is her winter. Not the grand winter of tales and songs, not the winter where heroes quest and kingdoms fall. Not tragedy but tedium. The small, grinding winter of cold nights and empty hours. The winter of waiting. When spring finally comes, and it will come eventually, she'll walk the battlements to feel the Thor beneath her feet, to see the snow melting. The relief will be so profound it will feel almost spiritual, almost like resurrection. She'll stand in sunlight and weep with gratitude. But that morning is months away, still so distant, it might as well be in another life. For now there's only this endless night, this cold that seeps into everything, into stone and bone and soul. For now there's only endurance. She thinks about writing to her husband again, trying to explain what these winters do to her, what they take from her. But what would she say? That wouldn't sound like madness or weakness. How could she make him understand that it's not the cold that keeps her awake but the thought that warmth may never return? That summer is a dream she once had, that each winter feels longer than the last, harder to endure, as if the season is gradually claiming more of. The year that she can feel winter tightening its grip year by year, that she fears one winter she simply won't survive, not physically, but in some deeper way, some essential part of her, that the cold will finally reach her core and turn her to stone, like the surrounding walls, leaving only a statue in her shape. That one morning she'll wake and feel nothing at all. These are the thoughts that come in the darkest hours, when even faith feels distant and prayer seems empty. She knows they'll seem melodramatic in daylight, exaggerated by darkness and sleeplessness, but that doesn't make them less real. Now, at this moment, the maid stirs and rises, sensing somehow that the fire needs tending, even in her sleep. She comes to tend the fire, her footsteps soft across the floor. She adds wood from the stack beside the hearth, blows gently on the embers with a bellows, coaxing them back to flame with practiced skill. The new fire catches and grows, pushing back the darkness slightly, reclaiming territory from shadow. Avellaneda watches from behind her curtains, grateful for the light more than the warmth, grateful for any change in the unchanging night. "My lady," the maid calls softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "shall I bring you something from the kitchens, wine or bread, some warm milk?" "No," Ellen answers, her voice rough from disuse cracking slightly. "Just tend the fire, that's enough." She doesn't want food or drink, doesn't want anything, but for this night to end. The maid nods and continues her work, poking at the logs until they shift and settle. The flames grow brighter and Avellaneda feels their warmth beginning to reach her bed, crossing the distance between hearth and bed. It's a small warmth, barely enough to notice, it's not enough to make her comfortable. But it's something, a small mercy in a long night, a tiny victory over darkness and cold. She clings to it like a rope thrown to someone drowning. She closes her eyes again and tries once more to sleep, making another attempt at escape. This time, mercifully, it comes not peace, but unconsciousness, which is close enough. She slips away from the cold chamber, away from her thoughts. The fire burns on through the remaining hours of darkness, tended by the faithful maid. The wind continues its song in the chimney, its endless complaint. The castle holds itself against winter's siege and Eleanor sleeps finally, as dawn approaches, unseen beyond the frost-etched windows in the British Museum, behind glass that reflects. The faces of modern visitors, there rests an object that speaks of winter desperation, with a silence more eloquent than any label could provide. It's a metal bed warmer from the 14th century, a long-handled pan with a hinged lid perforated in careful patterns to release heat without releasing embers. Its surface dark with age and use. The handle is charred at its end, blackened by hands that held it too close to flame in their urgency to complete the nightly ritual. The pan itself shows signs of intense heat that warped the metal over years of service, bending it subtly out of true, creating small waves in what was once a flat surface. Someone used this device night after night through countless winters, filling it with glowing coals from the hearth, then sliding it between linen sheets to chase away the cold that settled, like a living thing, into every fiber and fold. The repetition of this act, hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, left its mark not just on the metal but in the very shape the object took, conforming itself to the desperate human need it served. Similar objects have been found in excavations across medieval Europe, in castle keeps and manor houses, in monastery dormitories and merchant homes, in the buried foundations of buildings that collapsed centuries ago. Each discovery adds another voice to a chorus of silent testimony about how people lived, how they slept, how they survived the dark months. Some are elegant, decorated with engravings of saints or heraldic symbols, the work of skilled metalworkers who understood that even utilitarian objects could carry beauty and meaning. These belong to the wealthy, to families who could afford to have their struggle against cold made beautiful. Others are crude, hammered together from scrap metal by hands that knew only necessity, repaired many times with rough welds and patches, before finally being discarded when repair became impossible. Each one represents the same fundamental struggle, regardless of the elegance of its execution, the human need for warmth in a world that offered it grudgingly, if at all. But these artifacts raise as many questions as they answer standing in their display cases, like riddles written in metal and soot. The burn marks and melted handles suggest something more than simple use. They hint at desperation, at risks taken in the name of comfort, at moments when the fear of cold outweighed the fear of fire. Fire in a medieval bed was a constant danger, discussed in hushed tones around hearths, warned against in household rules mourned in the aftermath of tragedy. Straw mattresses, linen sheets, wool blankets, all of it would ignite in seconds if an ember escaped its container, sending flames racing through a room faster than a person could wake and react. Castle records from across Europe mention fires that started in bed chambers, sometimes destroying entire sections of buildings and taking lives in the smoke-filled darkness. Chronicles describe how quickly disaster could unfold, a forgotten ember, a careless moment, and then screams in the night as fire consumed wood and fabric with equal hunger. In 1331, a fire in York Minster began when a bed warmer set a servant's straw pallet all light, the flames spreading through the sleeping quarters before anyone could raise an alarm. The blaze traveled along wooden beams and up through the roof structure till it consumed the cathedral's wooden roof, sending burning timbers crashing down into the nave below. Yet people continued to use them night after night, accepting the risk as preferable to the alternative. They knew too well the cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was perceived as dangerous, even deadly, a force that could stop hearts and freeze breath in sleeping throats. Medieval medical theory held that cold could corrupt the humors, allowing disease to take root in the body like rot in damp wood. Warmth wasn't just comfort. It was considered essential to health itself, the difference between a body that could resist sickness and one that succumbed to every passing malady. Physicians wrote treatises on the importance of maintaining warmth during sleep, describing in elaborate detail how cold night air could penetrate the body's defenses. They recommended keeping windows sealed, fires burning and bodies covered with multiple layers, all in service of preserving the vital heat that sustained life. Some bed warmers show evidence of ritual use, patterns carved into the metal that match protective symbols found in other medieval contexts, designs that served purposes beyond mere decoration, circles within circles, crosses with equal arms, strange combinations of letters that might be abbreviations of prayers or invocations meant to bind protective forces to the object. Were these meant to protect the sleeper from the spiritual dangers of cold, not just the physical? Medieval people made little distinction between the two, understanding the world as a place where material and spiritual forces intertwined, where a cold room might harbor threats to both body and soul. In their understanding, cold was an active force, not merely the absence of heat, but a presence in itself, with intentions and agency. It crept, it invaded, it sought out human warmth to extinguish, moving through cracks and gaps like an invisible predator seeking prey. Fire was its opposite, an enemy. Divine light made manifest, pushing back the encroaching darkness and cold with a warmth that came from God Himself. To sleep beside heat was to sleep under protection, surrounded by a force that kept at bay not just physical discomfort but spiritual danger. This explains, perhaps, the superstitions that grew up around bedtime fires, the small rituals that people performed with the same seriousness they brought to prayers. In some regions it was considered unlucky to let a bed warmer grow completely cold before morning. Doing so invited misfortune or illness, as if the dying of the warmth opened a door to malevolent forces. In others, the ashes from bed warmers were carefully collected and scattered in gardens, believed to carry blessings from the household fire into the earth itself. What was once warm retained a memory of warmth even after the heat had fled, and that memory could be transferred, shared, used to bless and protect. Archaeological work at castle sites has revealed another mystery: slaves in bed chamber walls blackened by centuries of soot that seemed designed to hold burning blazers through the night. These loves are positioned near where beds would have stood, sometimes dangerously close within reach of a sleeper's outstretched hand. The design suggests these were not accidental features, but intentional elements of castle architecture built into the walls during construction. Someone decided in the planning stages that the risk of fire was worth the certainty of warmth, that bed chambers needed these small hearths regardless of the danger. They posed. At Kenilworth Castle in England, one such alcove was found to contain fragments of animal bone alongside the usual ash and charcoal, scattered among the soot in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. The bones showed signs of intentional burning, not the random inclusion of kitchen waste that sometimes ended up in hearth fires. Some scholars believe these were offerings, small sacrifices to ensure the fire's constancy through the dark hours, gifts to whatever forces governed heat and flame. Others argue they were simply fuel burned when wood grew scarce, during harsh winters, when every combustible material became precious. The truth is probably less mysterious than either explanation. Medieval people used whatever burned, including bones, tallow and peat, adapting their fuel sources to whatever was available. But the positioning of these loves remains curious, their proximity to sleeping bodies, a testament to how desperately warmth was needed. In one Scottish keep, excavators found a channel running through the walls, a primitive attempt at heating, where hot air from a fire in one room was meant to flow into the bed chamber above through carefully constructed passages. The system doesn't appear to have worked well. Soot deposits suggest the smoke backed up rather than drawing properly, and the channel was later filled in with rubble. But its existence speaks to a deeper truth: people were not passive in their suffering, not resigned to endure without resistance. They experimented, innovated, sought solutions to the relentless cold, trying methods that might work and abandoning them when they failed. Some solutions were communal, recognizing that bodies together generated more warmth than bodies separated. Records from monasteries describe monks sleeping in long halls, their beds arranged side by side with minimal space between, sometimes only inches, separating one sleeper from the next. This wasn't just efficient use of space, it was strategic sharing of body heat, a practical arrangement that turned necessity into a form of unspoken cooperation. The breathing of 40 men in a closed room raises the temperature measurably, creating a microclimate of shared warmth that benefited everyone present. Castle servants employed the same strategy, their quarters designed for maximum density rather than privacy or comfort. In the quarters near the kitchens, pallets were arranged so closely that sleepers would touch shoulders and backs throughout the night, their bodies forming a collective source of heat that no individual could generate alone. No one slept alone if they could avoid it, not by choice but by survival instinct. To be alone in winter was to be cold, and to be cold was to be in danger, vulnerable to both the physical effects of freezing and the spiritual threats that darkness brought. Even the nobility practiced this, though they disguised it as propriety and proper household management, rather than admitting the practical need. A noble lady might sleep with her maidservant in the same chamber, the arrangement justified by the need for attendance at all hours. The servant on a trundle bed that could be pulled out from beneath the lady's larger bed. At night, warmth flowed between them, the lady's greater comfort balanced by the servant's proximity to the fire and the mutual benefit of shared body heat. Neither acknowledged this exchange openly, but both understood it, accepting the unspoken bargain that preserved dignity while serving necessity. In the coldest regions, families would bring their livestock into the first floor of their dwellings. When winter arrived in earnest, the animals' heat rose through the floorboards, warming the living spaces above, a practical arrangement that turned cows and sheep into unwitting radiators. Their metabolism converting fodder into the warmth that kept families alive. This practice created its own challenges: the smell, the noise, the risk of disease passing between animals and humans in close quarters. But the alternative was worse, and so people adapted, accepting these discomforts as the price of survival through the frozen months. Castle accounts sometimes mention the purchase of dogs specifically for bed-chamber use, listed among household expenses alongside candles and firewood. These weren't pets in the modern sense, valued for companionship or hunting ability alone, but functional heat sources, living bed warmers that required feeding instead of fuel. Large hunting dogs were preferred, bred for size and the warmth of their bodies as much as for their ability to bring down game. They would curl at the foot of the bed or lie on top of covers, providing steady heat through the night, their breathing adding warmth to the air. This practice was so common it appears in religious texts as metaphor, the faithful dog warming its master, loyal even in sleep, never abandoning its post. But the metaphor was rooted in plain necessity, in the real function these animals served. In medieval households, some castles kept cats for the same purpose, though they were less reliable partners in the fight against cold. A cat might wander off midnight, taking its warmth elsewhere, following its own insurable purposes and leaving the sleeper to wake in sudden cold, shivering and resentful. The wealthy could afford more exotic solutions, purchasing materials that ordinary people could never hope to obtain. Man and mink furs were prized not just for their status but for their insulating properties. The density of their pelts trapped air and held body heat close, creating a barrier against the cold that wool and linen couldn't match. A single hermine coverlet might contain the skins of hundreds of animals, each one trapped in the northern forests, where the pelts were whitest and most valuable. The cost was enormous, representing years of income for a common worker. But for those who could afford it, the investment meant the difference between comfortable sleep and freezing endurance. Feather mattresses served a similar purpose, not just softness but warmth, the primary consideration in their design. The air trapped between feathers created insulation holding body heat rather than letting it escape into the straw and stone below, turning the mattress itself into a kind of thermal barrier. But even these luxuries had their limits, their effectiveness constrained by the fundamental reality of medieval buildings. Archaeologists examining preserved medieval bedding found evidence of dampness even in noble sleeping quarters, the condensation of breath and body moisture in cold rooms, soaking into fabric and never quite drying, defeating the purpose of even the finest materials. This dampness made everything colder, creating a vicious cycle where comfort bred discomfort. Wet wool and linen conduct heat away from the body far more efficiently than dry materials, a cruel irony where the very coverings meant to provide warmth became agents of cold, drawing heat from the skin and dissipating it into the air. Some medieval texts recommend changing bed linens frequently to prevent this accumulation of moisture, suggesting weekly or even more frequent changes. But in winter there was nowhere to dry wet linens except by the fire, and fires were needed for cooking and heating. For all the other demands of daily survival. The result was a kind of compromise with discomfort, accepting some degree of dampness as inevitable, layering more covering on top to compensate rather than solving the underlying Problem. Sleep became a matter of managing cold rather than achieving warmth, of making discomfort bearable rather than creating genuine comfort. Letters between nobility occasionally mentioned the quality of sleep as a kind of competition or conversation piece, a topic of discussion that revealed much about household management and resources. "I slept warm last night" was a boast, evidence of successful household management and perhaps divine favor, a sign that God smiled upon the household. These letters also reveal the opposite: complaints about cold nights, requests for advice on improving sleeping arrangements, descriptions of discomfort that paint a vivid picture of suffering. Some correspondents wrote of waking with frost on their blankets, of ice forming in water basins kept beside beds, of breath visible in the bed chamber, even with fires burning. The philosopher Roger Bacon, writing in the 13th century, proposed that warmth during sleep was essential to the formation of dreams, arguing that the body's heat during rest influenced the mind's visions. He believed cold sleep produced nightmares, while warm sleep allowed prophetic visions connecting physical comfort to spiritual insight. Whether this was medical theory or wishful thinking, it reflects how central the question of warmth was to medieval consciousness, how it permeated even philosophical discourse. Even the quality of one's dreams was thought to depend on it, making warmth during sleep not just a matter of physical comfort but of spiritual and mental health. Some castle inventories list warming stones, large, smooth rocks that would be heated in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed in beds. Unlike metal bed warmers, these retained heat for hours, cooling so gradually that the change was barely noticed, providing steady warmth through the darkest hours. The practice continued in rural areas into the 20th century, a medieval solution that outlasted the Middle Ages themselves by hundreds of years. Its effectiveness lay in simplicity: stone is everywhere, heating, it costs nothing, and the result is reliable warmth without the danger of fire. But in castles where appearance mattered as much as function, elaborate metal bed warmers were preferred, despite their limitations. They could be engraved with family crests, displayed as evidence of wealth, handed down as heirlooms that carried the family's history and status from one generation to the next. Function and status intertwined as they did in so many aspects of medieval life, each reinforcing the other. Even the struggle against cold became an opportunity to display rank, to demonstrate wealth and refinement through the quality of one's bed warmer or the thickness of one's furs. Yet all these solutions, bedward, furs, dogs, stones, shared a fundamental limitation that no amount of wealth or ingenuity could overcome: they provided borrowed warmth, heat taken from one source and temporarily applied to another, never generating anything new but only redistributing what already existed. The fire gave its warmth to the metal pan, the pan gave it to the sheets gave it to the sleeper. Each transfer less efficient than the last, but at each transfer some was lost, dissipating into cold air and colder stone, radiating away into the vast cold mass of medieval buildings that absorbed heat like a sponge absorbs water. By morning, everything was cold again. The warmth fled as if it had never been. The cycle began anew, lighting fires, heating objects, chasing warmth through another day, repeating the same rituals that had been performed the night before and would be performed again the next night. This sense of warmth, as temporary, as something that must be constantly renewed through effort and vigilance, shaped medieval attitudes toward comfort itself. Nothing lasted, nothing was permanent, except the cold, which waited patiently for the fires to die and the warmth to dissipate. Perhaps this is why medieval religious texts so often used warmth as a metaphor for divine grace. Both were conceived as gifts from outside, temporary visitations rather than permanent possessions. Both could be withdrawn at any moment, leaving the soul as cold and bereft as a body without fire. The language of religious devotion borrowed extensively from the vocabulary of fire and warmth, speaking of hearts, aflame with love of God, of the Holy Spirit's warming presence, of charity as a fire that warmed all it touched. These weren't empty metaphors, but comparisons rooted in lived experience in the daily struggle to maintain warmth. To sleep warm in a medieval castle was to sleep in gratitude, aware that the comfort was fragile and fleeting, dependent on human effort and divine blessing in equal measure. The cold waited patiently beyond the circle of firelight, ready to return, a constant presence that never truly departed and return it always did. As certain as dawn, as inevitable as darkness, morning came with its chill breath, dispersing warmth like smoke, reminding every soul that winter was lord of the stone halls, that human comfort existed only by its temporary sufferance. The bed warmers in museum collections, with their scorch marks and worn handles, tell this story more eloquently than words. Their surfaces recording hundreds of nights of use. Each mark is a night someone fought against the cold, each repair a determination to try again, to continue the struggle rather than surrender to discomfort. The handles are worn smooth where hands grip them night after night. The metal shaped by repeated contact with human skin. These where patterns reveal the grip, the angle at which the bed warmer was held, the pressure applied by hands desperate to prepare a bed for sleep. Some bed warmers show repairs that must have been expensive, suggesting that even broken or damaged warmers were too valuable to discard. Patches were soldered on, handles were replaced, hinges were mended, anything to extend the life of an object that served such a vital function. These were not people resigned to suffering, accepting cold as an unchangeable fact of existence. They were people who innovated, who shared, who risked fire for the sake of warmth, who understood that comfort must be created anew each night through effort and care. In this sense, the mystery of the bed warmers is not really a mystery at all, but rather a window into daily life. It's simply the human story told in metal and ash, the endless patient struggle to carve out small spaces of comfort. In an indifferent world that offered no natural refuge from winter, the cold was not an enemy that could be defeated, not something that could be permanently banished through any amount of effort or ingenuity. It was only one that could be temporarily held at bay, pushed back for a few hours before inevitably returning. And so they held it, night after night, generation after generation, passing down knowledge and techniques for maintaining warmth. Grandmothers taught mothers, who taught daughters, the proper way to prepare a bed, to heat a bed warmer, to layer coverings for maximum warmth. This knowledge was practical but also sacred, part of the essential wisdom that meant the difference between survival and death. To know how to stay warm was to know how to live. And this knowledge was shared as carefully as any other valuable possession. Their warmth was borrowed, yes, borrowed from fire, from animals, from each other, taken from wherever it could be found and carefully conserved. But borrowed warmth, they learned, was better than none at all, worth the effort of obtaining and maintaining. And in the borrowing, in the sharing, in the nightly renewal of the struggle, something else was created, not just warmth, but the human bonds that form around shared hardship, the comfort of knowing others fought the same fight, suffered the same cold, sought the same solutions. Servants who slept in crowded quarters developed loyalties and friendships forged in the shared experience of cold nights. Families who huddled together for warmth created intimacies that prosperity might later erode, but which winter demanded and nurtured. Even between classes, the shared struggle against cold created a kind of understanding, though it might never be openly acknowledged. The noble lady and her maidservant, sharing a chamber through the winter, developed a relationship shaped by their mutual need for warmth, by the practical reality that comfort required cooperation. The monasteries understood this, making the shared struggle against cold part of their spiritual discipline. Monks who slept in communal halls learned humility in their dependence on each other's body heat, learned patience in enduring discomfort. Together learned charity in the sharing of limited warmth. These lessons extended beyond the sleeping hall, shaping how communities functioned during the long dark months. Winter created dependencies that summer's abundance erased, forcing people to rely on each other in ways that prosperity made unnecessary. The sharing of fire was regulated by custom and sometimes by law, with expectations that those who had fire would share warmth with those who had none. A hearth that blazed while neighbors froze violated not just charity but community cohesion, threatening the social bonds that made collective survival possible. Castle halls became gathering places in winter, where people from throughout the surrounding area might come to share warmth from fires they could not maintain in their own homes. This wasn't charity but mutual obligation, a recognition that some resources were too important to be hoarded. These gatherings served multiple purposes: warmth, yes, but also news, entertainment, the maintenance of social bonds that would matter when spring arrived. People told stories, sang songs, shared knowledge and gossip, all while warming themselves by fires fed by the castle's wood supplies. The smoke from these fires marked castles from miles away, rising into winter skies like signals to a cold world. To see smoke was to know that fire still burned, that warmth still existed, that the human community had not yet succumbed to winter's siege, and it was a siege no less real, for being fought against weather rather than armies. Medieval writers described winter in martial terms as an invader, a conqueror, a force that surrounded and besieged human habitations, cutting them off from the world. The preparation for winter resembled preparation for war, gathering supplies, securing defenses, ensuring that enough fuel and food existed to outlast the assault. Those who failed to prepare adequately faced consequences as dire as any defeated army. Chronicles record winters that killed the unprepared, describing bodies found frozen in their homes, hearths cold because fuel had run out or was never gathered. These deaths were preventable but required planning and effort, recognition that winter was coming and would be merciless to those who ignored its approach. The bed warmer, in this context, becomes more than a simple tool for comfort. It represents the human refusal to surrender, the determination to carve out comfort even in the depths of winter's siege, to create small victories against an overwhelming force. Each night that ended in warm sleep was such a victory, modest but real. Each morning that dawned with the sleeper alive and intact, was evidence that human ingenuity and effort could hold back natural forces, at least temporarily. The bed warmers preserved in museums are survivors of their own kind, objects that lasted when most of their contemporaries were lost to rust and decay. They exist now as testimony, evidence of how our ancestors lived and struggled and endured. Behind the museum glass, they speak to us across centuries, telling stories of cold nights and desperate measures, of risks taken and comfort sought. They remind us that the past was not a romantic pageant but a place of real hardship, where comfort required constant effort. The people who used these bed warmers, nobles and servants, monks and merchants, are long gone. Their names mostly forgotten, their faces lost to time. But something of them survives in the objects they used, in the marks left by their hands, in the evidence of their daily struggle. We can read their lives in the wear patterns on a handle, in the repairs made to extend an object's usefulness, in the careful engravings that turn necessity into something beautiful. These details reveal people who cared about how they lived, who sought not just survival but dignity and comfort. The medieval world, seen through these objects, becomes less remote and more human. The distance of centuries collapses when we recognize in these bedward our own desire for warmth, our own willingness to take risks for comfort, our own ingenuity in solving problems. Winter still comes, though we meet it with technologies. Those medieval sleepers could never have imagined central heating, electric blankets, insulated buildings. We've solved the problems that plagued them, made warmth reliable and constant rather than borrowed and temporary. But something has been lost too, perhaps the awareness of warmth as precious, the gratitude for comfort, the bonds formed in shared struggle. We take for granted what they fought for, nightly assume as basic what they considered luxury. The bed warmers remind us of this difference, standing in their cases like ambassadors from a harder world. They speak of a time when sleep itself required courage. When the simple act of going to bed involved risk and preparation, when warmth was not a given but an achievement. In learning about their struggle we perhaps gain perspective on our own comfort, recognition of how far human ingenuity has brought us. The distance from a charred bed warmer to a thermostat represents not just technological progress but a fundamental change in how we experience the world. Yet the basic human need remains unchanged, the desire for warmth, for comfort, for safety in sleep. The tools have changed, but the need persists, as fundamental to us as it was to them, as essential to human well-being now as it was then. The bed warmer in the British Museum will remain behind its glass, slowly gathering the dust of centuries, silent except to those who take time to hear its story. But that story is worth hearing, worth preserving, worth remembering. It tells us who we are by showing us where we came from, reminds us that comfort is not automatic but achieved, that warmth, like all good things, requires effort and care. It speaks across the centuries in a voice of metal and ash, telling tales of winter nights and borrowed warmth, of human persistence in the face of cold that seemed eternal but could, with effort and ingenuity, be held at bay. And in those tales we find not just history but something deeper, recognition of our shared humanity, of the struggles that connect us across time, of the endless human effort to create comfort and meaning in a world that offers neither. Freely the borrowed warmth they sought night after night through all those frozen centuries, echoes in our own continuing quest for comfort, for safety, for the simple blessing of a warm bed on a cold night. The great hall of a medieval castle, during the feast hour, presents a curious spectacle, one that reveals more about the nature of power than any throne or crown ever could. At the high table nearest the roaring hearth, the lord and lady sit in furred splendor, their faces flushed with heat and wine, bathed in the direct radiance of flames that leap and dance behind iron grates. 20 feet away, at the lower tables, lesser nobles and wealthy merchants lean slightly forward, angling for whatever warmth might reach them across the stone-flagged distance. Their posture is subtle but unmistakable, a slight inclination of the shoulders, a positioning of chairs that edges incrementally closer to the source of comfort, without appearing to beg for it. And beyond them, standing along the walls in their designated stations, servants and petitioners feel almost nothing, just the memory of heat, a suggestion of comfort that never quite arrives. They shift from foot to foot on cold stone, their fingers stiff watching the fire light, paint shadows across faces. They serve but can never join. This is the geography of medieval warmth, not democratic, not equitable, but strictly hierarchical in ways that make the social order visible and physical. The closer you sit to power, the closer you sit to the fire, and this arrangement is neither accidental nor merely practical. In winter, this arrangement becomes more than symbolic, more than a convenient reflection of status. Physical comfort and social status merge into a single visible truth. Warmth itself is a privilege measured out in degrees that correspond precisely to one's place in the intricate Latin of medieval society. The gradations are so precise they might have been calculated by mathematicians. A duke feels the fire's full force. An earl receives its generous reflection. A knight catches its diminished glow. A merchant might sense its distant presence. A servant knows only that somewhere, beyond the bodies and the smoke, something burns. This hierarchy extends beyond the hall into every corner of castle life, creating an invisible map of thermal privilege that everyone understands without needing to articulate. To question it would be to question the entire structure of the world as they know it. The Lord's chamber, usually located in the keep's most protected interior, away from outer walls where winter winds prowl, is an island of carefully maintained comfort in a sea of cold. Every detail is designed to preserve heat and project power, simultaneously creating a space where physical luxury and political authority become indistinguishable. The walls are covered floor to ceiling in tapestries, some imported from Flanders at enormous cost, their wool heavy with linoline and worked in scenes of hunting, mythology or biblical triumph. These heavy woven scenes don't just decorate, they insulate, creating a textile barrier between stone and air that traps warmth like a held breath. The finest tapestries are placed on exterior walls, where cold seeps through mortar and stone, while lesser examples might hang on interior walls, where their function is more aesthetic than practical. The arrangement is strategic, the result of generations of experience with cold and its movements through architecture. The bed itself is an architectural statement, a massive structure with posts that support heavy curtains on all four sides, carved from oak or walnut by craftsmen who understood that this piece of furniture was as important as any fortification. When drawn, these curtains transform the bed into a room within a room, a fabric cave that traps body heat and breath in a space no larger than necessary. Inside this enclosed space, the air grows warm and close, humid, with breathing thick. With the presence of a sleeping body. It's not entirely comfortable. By morning the curtains smell of sleep and exhalation of the night's accumulated moisture, but it's far warmer than the chamber outside, where frost sometimes traces patterns on glass panes. The contrast is so extreme that emerging from bed curtains in winter morning feels like plunging into cold water. Lords have been known to delay this moment for as long as possible, calling for servants to bring warmed clothing into the bed, itself dressing within the curtains. Before facing the chamber beyond. The floor is covered with layers of coverings, first rushes harvested from wetlands and strewn thick, then woven mats of rush or reed, then, in the wealthiest households, actual carpets imported from the east at costs that would feed a village for months. Each layer traps air, creating insulation between foot and stone, building a barrier against the earth's relentless cold that rises through foundations and flags. These floor coverings require constant maintenance and replacement. The rushes grow musty and must be changed seasonally. The mats wear thin in paths of frequent traffic. The precious carpets need careful beating and airing to prevent rot in the perpetual dampness of stone chambers. Blazers stand at strategic points around the chamber, not just one, but sometimes 3 or 4 each, glowing with charcoal that must be tended through the night, like small gods of warmth demanding constant sacrifice. A servant sleeps nearby for this purpose, waking periodically to add fuel to ensure the fires never die, and the chamber never descends into the killing cold that waits just beyond the maintained warmth. The placement of these blazers reflects sophisticated understanding of air movement and heat distribution, one near the bed, one by the chamber entrance to combat drafts, one near the window where cold enters most aggressively, one near the Lord's chair where he might sit before sleeping to read correspondence by fire. Light candles burn in silver stands, not just for light but for the small warmth their flames provide. Each tiny fire a contribution to the room's carefully orchestrated temperature. Beeswax, not tallow. Its scent is cleaner, appropriate to noble nostrils, and it burns longer, more steadily, without the guttering and smoking that cheaper candles produce. The cost of these candles alone would seem extravagant to anyone outside noble circles. A single night might consume as much beeswax as a merchant household would use in a month, each candle representing hours of labor by skilled chandlers. Even the clothing laid out for sleep is carefully chosen, selected not for appearance but for its thermal properties, in ways that would seem obsessive if comfort were not so hard. 1. Multiple layers of linen undergarments, a woolen nightgown, a fur-lined cap to keep heat from escaping through the head, all arranged in precise order for efficient donning in cold chambers. The noble feet, so important for maintaining warmth and so vulnerable to cold rising from stone floors, are wrapped in wool socks and sometimes enclosed in small bags of fur. Medieval sleeping bags that covered from toe to calf. Some of these survive in museum collections. Lined with rabbit or squirrel fur, worn smooth by use, the leather softened by years of nightly ritual, these foot bags represent a peculiar intersection of luxury and necessity. They cost as much as a good wool cloak, required skilled friars to construct, and yet were essentially hidden from view. Comfort items whose existence acknowledged the limits of wealth to truly conquer cold. All of this, the layers, the fires, the textiles, the servants, the endless cycle of preparation and maintenance, represents an enormous expenditure of resources and labor. Dozens of servants work to maintain this bubble of warmth around their lord, their own comfort sacrificed to create his, their cold hands tending fires that warm another's sleep. Wood must be cut, carried and stored in vast quantities, occupying entire buildings dedicated to fuel storage. One castle account from 1340 records the winter consumption of oak at 40 cart loads, more than 200 tons of wood burned in 3 months. Forests converted into heat and ash. The logistics of this consumption are staggering. Trees must be selected, felled, transported, seasoned, split and delivered in an endless chain of labor that employs dozens of workers throughout the year, simply to keep one household warm through winter. Charcoal must be produced in forest furnaces, a process that takes weeks and requires specialized knowledge passed down through families of charcoal burners. A single brazier burning through the night consumes what a peasant family might use in a week of cooking, representing a casual expenditure of resources that marks privilege as clearly as any crown. The production of charcoal is itself a complex art. Wood must be stacked precisely in earth kiln covered with turf and burned slowly in controlled conditions that convert wood to concentrated heat. The process requires constant attention, and a mistake can result in days of wasted labor. Fabric must be woven, sewn into curtains and coverings, maintained through seasons of use and eventually replaced as it rots from dampness and smoke, its fibers succumbing to the moisture that pervades every stone building. The tapestries that line noble chambers represent years of labor by skilled weavers, their hands moving through tens of thousands of individual thread placements to create images that will, in the end, serve primarily as insulation. These textiles arrive in castles as treasures. Their colors bright, their scenes crisp and clear. Within a decade they darken with smoke, their edges fray from handling, their images blur into suggestion. But they continue serving their primary purpose of holding back cold, growing more valuable as insulation, even as they lose aesthetic worth. And yet, despite all this effort and expense, despite the armies of servants and forests of fuel, the cold still finds its way in castle. Accounts mention lords complaining of poor sleep, of waking to find frost on the inside of windows, of feeling drafts through supposedly sealed chambers, of nights when no amount of covering seems sufficient against winter's invasion. The drafts are particularly maddening, invisible currents of cold air that seem to flow through solid stone, finding gaps in mortar spaces around window frames, openings where tapestries don't quite reach the floor. These drafts move through chambers like cold ghosts, extinguishing candles and stealing warmth with persistent malice. King Edward of England, in letters to his chamberlain, repeatedly demands improvements to the royal apartments at the Tower of London, his frustration evident in increasingly our commands. The chambers are too cold, he writes, unsuitable for winter residence, unworthy of a king and yet seemingly immune to improvement. His letters reveal a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed, confronting a force that does not acknowledge authority. Stone and wind and winter do not care about royal blood or political power. They simply continue their ancient patterns regardless of human protests. Even kings cannot command the weather or force warmth into unwilling stone, cannot order cold to cease, as they might order an army to halt or a subject to comply. The performance of comfort, the appearance of warmth and ease, is easier to maintain than the reality, and medieval nobles become masters of this performance, even as they privately shiver. Visitors to a noble chamber would see the fires burning bright, smell the scented candles mixing their sweetness with wood smoke, feel the softness of fur beneath their feet where carpets created an illusion of luxury. They would conclude that here at least, winter has been conquered, that wealth and power have achieved what common folk can only dream of, true comfort in the season of cold. But the noble lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, listening to wind howl around the tower like voices of the dead, knows differently. The warmth is real but fragile, requiring constant maintenance and still insufficient against determined cold. A temporary victory that must be won, anew each night. There's a portrait from the 15th century, a French nobleman in his bed chamber, painted by a court artist commissioned to document the luxury and ease of noble life. He sits upright in bed wearing a fur-lined robe over his nightclub, a cap on his head, despite being indoors in what should be the warm sanctum of his private space. Behind him, we can see the bed curtains pulled back to reveal the chamber's careful arrangement, the brazier glowing nearby with its promise of warmth, a servant in the background attending to something, perhaps adding fuel or adjusting curtains. The scene is meant to show comfort, leisure, the ease of noble life, where even sleep is surrounded by beauty and service. But look closely at the nobleman's face, study it with attention to what the artist captured beyond conscious intention. His expression is not relaxed but alert, almost tense, his eyes, reflecting a wakefulness that speaks of cold, interrupted sleep rather than peaceful rest, and his hands, emerging from the fur-lined sleeves like pale creatures seeking shelter, are positioned near the brazier, seeking its warmth, with a gesture that contradicts the portrait's intended message of achieved comfort. The fingers are slightly curved, reaching toward heat with unconscious hunger. The portrait accidentally captures the truth beneath the performance, that, even surrounded by the trappings of comfort, cold remains a presence that must be actively resisted every moment. Warmth here is not a state of being but a constant activity, a battle that never fully ends, even in victory. Castle inventories reveal the extent of this performance, the sheer quantity of materials required to maintain the illusion and partial reality of noble comfort. One 14th-century French castle listed among its possessions 43 fur coverlets, 80 wool blankets, 36 feather mattresses and 28 bed curtains of various qualities, each item representing significant investment and requiring dedicated storage and maintenance. This was not excess for the sake of luxury alone, not mere decoration or display. It was the minimum required to keep a noble household warm through winter. Each item would be rotated through the chambers as needed, some used while others aired in whatever sunshine winter provided, some being repaired by servants whose entire occupation consisted of maintaining bedding. The logistics of managing all this was itself a full-time occupation requiring organizational skills and practical knowledge. The chamberlain oversaw it with the attention of a military commander, but beneath him was a small army of servants specializing in bedding, heating and textile maintenance, each with specific responsibilities. In the endless campaign against cold, they knew which rooms held warmth best, which chambers needed extra blazers on particularly bitter nights, which beds required more layers depending on who slept in them and their particular susceptibility to cold. They knew to move the lord's sleeping quarters to the south-facing chambers in the deepest winter, taking advantage of whatever sun might appear during short days, shifting the entire bedroom establishment in a complex dance of thermal optimization. This knowledge was practical and hard. One passed from experienced servants to new ones through demonstration and correction rather than written instruction. The castle's institutional memory was more reliable than any written record, residing in the hands and habits of servants who had spent decades learning how cold moved through stone and how warmth could be captured and held. Yet all of this effort and expertise could be undone by a particularly harsh winter, by the arrival of weather so severe that human ingenuity simply could not compensate. When temperatures dropped far enough, when the wind blew cold enough and sustained enough, no amount of fuel or fabric could maintain comfort, and even the most elaborate preparations proved insufficient. Chronicles mention winters when wine froze in its vessels despite being stored in the warmest chambers, when ink froze in its wells, making correspondence impossible, when nobles abandoned their castles entirely and moved to town houses where smaller rooms were easier to heat. Even privilege had its limits, boundaries beyond which wealth and status provided no protection. The nobles themselves were aware of this irony that their stone fortresses built to project power and ensure safety from human enemies, became prisons of cold in winter. Some writings from the period express this explicitly, with a frankness that suggests the writers felt safe admitting weakness when the enemy was nature rather than man. A letter from a nobleman to his son, preserved in an archive and written with the blunt honesty that sometimes emerges between family members, offers this warning about castle life. The walls that protect you from your enemies will also protect the cold from leaving. You will learn to love summer as you never did before, to feel gratitude for heat that you took for granted in your youth. This creates a paradox at the heart of medieval noble life, a fundamental tension that shapes daily experience. The castle is both necessary and uncomfortable, both home and trial, both symbol of power and daily reminder of its limitations. A place where one must live to maintain status, but where living extracts a constant price in physical discomfort during feasts and ceremonies. This paradox could be temporarily resolved, the tensions between comfort and reality briefly suspended. The great hall would be filled with people, all their bodies, contributing warmth in collective heat generation, breath and presence, raising the temperature by simple mass of humanity. Gathered in enclosed space. The fires would burn high, fed extravagantly with the best wood, the largest logs, placed with theatrical timing to send flames leaping toward the rafters. For those hours, the performance became reality. The gap between appearance and experience temporarily closed. The castle was warm, genuinely warm, in ways that made the cold seem conquered rather than merely held at bay. The nobles were comfortable, their faces bright with more than wine, their bodies relaxed in authentic ease rather than the careful tension of maintained warmth. The hierarchy remained visible and validated each person's proximity to warmth, still corresponding to their social position. Warmth flowed outward from the high table in diminishing waves, each person receiving exactly as much comfort as their status allowed. The social order made literal in the distribution of heat. But when the feast ended, when the guests departed and the fires were banked for the night, the cold came creeping back like a patient predator that had merely been waiting. The nobles returned to their chambers, to their struggles with blazers and bed curtains, to their private battles with winter that no amount of public display could prevent. This gap between public performance and private experience defined much of noble life in ways that extended beyond questions of physical comfort. In public, they were powerful, comfortable, secure masters of their domains and their environments, people whose wishes became reality through the labor of others. In private, they were as vulnerable to cold as anyone else, perhaps more so for being so aware of the contrast between what should be and what was. The servant who had never known comfort might sleep easier than the lord who had tasted it and knew how fragile it was, how much labor and expense went into maintaining even its approximation. Some nobles developed elaborate bedtime rituals designed to maximize warmth and minimize the anxiety of cold nights that stretched ahead through dark hours. These routines were passed down within families, part of the informal education of young nobility. That included not just political and military training, but also the practical knowledge of how to survive in the fortresses their status required them to inhabit. One such ritual, described in a memoir from the 15th century with the detail of someone recording important knowledge, proceeds according to careful timing and sequence. The lord would dine late, ensuring his body was welled and warm from hot food whose heat would radiate from within for hours after consumption. He would drink warmed wine heavily spiced with cinnamon, clove and pepper, believed to generate heat from within by stimulating the body's humors. The wine was heated in special vessels placed near the fire, brought to just below boiling the spices, releasing their oils into the liquid in combinations that medieval medicine considered warming to the constitution. He would then proceed to his chamber at a precise hour, neither so early that the fire's work was incomplete, nor so late that cold had begun, reclaiming the space where servants had been preparing for hours. The bed curtains would already be closed, trapping warm air within the enclosed space, creating a microclimate that had been carefully cultivated through the evening. Bed warmers would have been passed between the sheets multiple times, metal pans filled with hot coals or heated stones wrapped in cloth moved systematically across every portion of the mattress to drive out the cold that stone walls inevitably transmitted. The sheets themselves might have been warmed by the fire before being spread, so that every element of the bed carried heat. Rather than requiring the lord's body to provide it all, he would undress near the brazier, removing clothing in stages while maintaining proximity to warmth, never fully exposed to cold air at any moment. Then he would enter the bed quickly, pulling the curtains shut behind him in a practiced motion that allowed minimal escape of the accumulated warmth, sealing himself in his fabric sanctuary. A servant would remain outside the curtains but within the chamber, sitting near the door on a small stool or pallet, tending the fire through the night. This servant's role required the ability to wake at intervals, without fully rousing, to maintain fires in a state between sleep and waking that some people possessed as a natural talent. If the Lord woke, and he often did, for the combination of wine and the need to urinate that came with it, or from dreams or from sudden awareness of cold, he could call softly for the servant to adjust the brazier. The servant would add fuel carefully, ensuring flames did not leap too high, but simply maintained the coal's glow. Would check the bed curtains for drafts where fabric had shifted. Would adjust the tapestries if wind made them billow. The servant's presence itself was comforting. Beyond the practical service, provided a guard against both cold and the fears that darkness brings to minds left alone with their thoughts. To wake in blackness, with no sound, but wind around stone, creates anxieties that another human presence, even one of lower status, helps to dispel. This arrangement. A noble, sealed in fabric warmth, a servant vigilant outside, maintaining conditions that made sleep possible, became a symbol of medieval hierarchy in miniature. The Lord's comfort required another service, and that service was so essential it continued even through sleep, the most private and vulnerable of human states. Yet there was also something almost intimate about these arrangements, something that contradicted the usual distance between ranks that social order required be maintained. The servant heard the Lord's breathing, its rhythm shifting between sleep stages, heard his dreams when they caused him to speak or cry out, heard his midnight fears. When cold or nightmare woke him fully. The Lord trusted his life, in a sense, to this servant. Fire in a bedroom being so dangerous, capable of spreading to bed curtains or floor coverings if neglected, even briefly. This trust created bonds that were rarely acknowledged openly but deeply felt by both parties, connections that existed outside the formal structures of lord and servant. Some servants spent decades in this role, becoming more familiar with their lord's sleeping habits than his own. Family was, accumulating intimate knowledge that had no formal value but tremendous personal significance. They knew when he slept soundly and when he woke, often could predict from evening mood what kind of night lay ahead, what nightmares troubled him, what morning mood to expect, based on the sounds of his sleep. This knowledge was power of a sort, though never one that could be openly wielded or even acknowledged without violating the social structures that governed every interaction. It existed in silence, in the careful navigation of class boundaries, in the strange territory between servant and intimate that medieval social theory had no language to describe. The relationship sometimes lasted a lifetime. A servant who began this work in youth might continue it into old age, sleeping outside his lord's chamber for 40 years or more, present for every vulnerable moment, witness to every private weakness that public performance concealed. When the noble finally slept, sealed in his fabric cave, surrounded by carefully maintained warmth and the knowledge that another human maintained vigilance, he slept alone, in the most fundamental sense. For all the servants and blazers and furs, for all the expense and effort, comfort could not be shared or transferred, only approximated, pursued, temporarily, achieved through labor that he would never fully comprehend. And in the morning he would emerge to cold stone floors in the same routines of maintenance and performance, the cycle beginning again. The cycle began again as it did for everyone, regardless of rank, as winter itself cycled through its own rhythms of bitter cold and moderate cold, of storms and clear freezing days, of nights that seemed endless in their dark chill. The irony that medieval nobles seemed only dimly aware of that their position prevented them from seeing clearly. Was this? Their elaborate attempts to separate themselves from winter's discomfort actually bound them more tightly to it. The more they fought the cold, the more elaborate their defenses became. The more conscious they became of it, the more they noticed every draft and temperature shift that someone accustomed to constant cold might not even register. The servant who accepted cold as inevitable, who had no expectation of warmth beyond what a single fire might provide, might suffer more physically, but perhaps less mentally. The noble who knew warmth was possible but difficult, who had experienced true comfort and knew its price in labor and resources, suffered the added torment of hope and expectation, repeatedly disappointed by reality. This perhaps explains why some nobles expressed a strange envy for simpler lives, not in ways that indicated actual willingness to exchange positions, but in wistful comments that revealed ambivalence about their privileges. Not that they would actually choose to live as servants, the loss of status and power would be unthinkable, but there was a recognition that there might be peace in having fewer expectations, less awareness of the gap between what should be and what is. In the end, the Lord's Chamber reveals the limits of medieval power more clearly than any battlefield defeat or political setback. You could command armies, hold lands, dispense justice over the lives and deaths of thousands, but you could not command warmth to stay or cold to leave, could not order stone to release the chill it held, could not force winter to acknowledge your authority. Every morning, as the fires were rebuilt and the day's performance began again, as servants opened curtains and lords emerged to face another day of maintaining appearances, this lesson was quietly repeated. Power was real, substantial, capable of accomplishing remarkable things, but it was not absolute, not unlimited, not sufficient to overcome all obstacles. There were some battles that could not be won, only endured, survived, managed through seasons that would eventually pass but seemed endless while they lasted. The cold was one such battle, winter one such season, and stone castles one such battlefield, where defeat was never final but victory never complete. And in the deepest hours of winter nights, in the darkness behind bed curtains, while wind howled through arrow slits and around tower corners, every noble knew this truth. The knowledge came with waking in cold so deep that breath misted, even inside the curtained bed, with feeling drafts that found their way through every defense, with understanding that all the effort and expense had only achieved a marginal improvement over the alternative. The cold was patient, older than castles or kingdoms or the concept of nobility itself. It had always been there and would remain long after individual lives and dynasties ended, waiting in stone and air and winter darkness. It would outlast them all, every lord and servant, every castle and kingdom, every elaborate defense and performance of comfort. In the end, winter always won, not through dramatic conquest but through simple persistence, through being what it was while humans exhausted themselves trying to be warm. And so we come to the end of our journey through the cold and silent halls of medieval winter. We've walked these stone corridors together, felt the frost on ancient glass, listened to wind singing through arrow slits. We've lived alongside the servant waking before dawn to tend fires that never quite banished the chill. Furthermore, we've sat with Lady Avellaneda in her tower watching frost-etched patterns while sleep eludes her. Furthermore, we've examined the mysteries of bed warmers and borrowed heat, those small human innovations against an indifferent cold. And we've glimpsed the Lord's Chamber where comfort was performed as much as achieved. What connects these stories across differences of rank and circumstance is the simple, universal struggle with winter's patient siege. Every person in that castle, from the lowest servant to the highest noble, faced the same fundamental challenge: how to find rest when comfort remains elusive. They learned what we sometimes forget in our heated homes, that warmth is not a permanent state but a temporary victory, won through effort and renewed each day. That sleep in discomfort requires a kind of courage we rarely acknowledge. They learned to be grateful for small mercies, a moment near the fire, a dry cloak, a shared blanket's warmth. Furthermore, they learned that sometimes survival itself is achievement enough. And they learned something we might envy, that hardship, shared, creates bonds that comfort never can. The servant who slept shoulder to shoulder with others, the lady whose maid tended her brazier through the night, the lord who trusted a servant with fire in darkness, all these relationships were forged partly through the shared experience of winter. Tonight, as you lie in your own bed, warm, comfortable, safe from the elements, perhaps you can appreciate what they could not: the miracle of central heating, of insulation, of warmth that arrives without thought or effort. You don't need to wake before dawn to light fires or carry water from frozen wells. You don't need to share body heat with strangers to survive the night. Your comfort is not borrowed, but given freely by technology and infrastructure. They couldn't imagine the cold that kept them awake does not reach you here yet. Perhaps there's something to learn from their experience about resilience, about gratitude, about the ways hardship shapes us into something stronger. They slept in cold and woke to cold, and still they continued. They found joy in small things, warmth in connection, rest. Despite discomfort, they learned to sleep, not because conditions were ideal, but because morning would come regardless, bringing work that required energy they could only restore through sleep. So as you drift off now in warmth and ease, remember them briefly, those countless souls who lay awake in stone chambers listening to the same wind that has blown for centuries. They, too, sought rest. They, too, dreamed of warmth, and in the morning they rose and continued building the world that would eventually give us the comfort they never knew. Their endurance was the foundation of our ease. The stones of medieval castles still stand in many places, weathered by centuries of seasons. If you visit them on a winter day, you might feel how cold they remain, how warmth cannot quite penetrate their depths. Those stones remember, in their way, all the winters they've witnessed, all the people who sought shelter within them and found only partial refuge. They remember the fires that were lit and died, the sleepers who came and went. But the stones also remember that winter, however long, eventually yields to spring. That warmth, however temporary, always returns. That sleep, however difficult, eventually finds us. And so tonight, let yourself drift into that sleep, grateful for the surrounding warmth, for the comfort that was earned through generations of human struggle against the cold. Let the quiet darkness embrace you gently. You are safe, you are warm, you are at rest. The wind that howled through medieval towers blows in a different time now, troubling sleepers long turned to dust. Your night is peaceful, your warmth is assured, and morning, when it comes, will find you rested, not cold and stiff like those medieval souls, but comfortable and renewed. Sleep well, traveler through history. Let these stories of ancient winters make your present warmth feel sweeter. Let the struggles of the past ease you into grateful rest. The castle is quiet now, its occupants gone to deeper sleep than any they knew in life, but their stories remain, whispered through stone corridors, settling like frost on cold glass. And you, listening here in the warmth of the present, carry these stories forward, a witness to their endurance, a beneficiary of their resilience. Their cold nights have become your comfortable sleep. Rest now in the warmth they could only dream of, and let history lull you gently into the darkness that brings renewal. Tomorrow is distant, tonight is warm, sleep comes softly and all is well. The stones remember, the wind remembers. But you need only remember this: you are warm, you are safe, and sleep is here at last.